Welcome back to the Worldwise Wealth Podcast. And in this episode, I sit down with Dr. Axel. Now, we talk all things international property investing. He himself holds property in over 8 countries around the globe, and he assists clients in acquiring properties not only in US markets, which we dive into in this conversation further, but in global markets, which is quite rare when we have experts on this show. A lot of them are US specific. He's originally from Germany. He moved to the US and he has a portfolio of properties across the world that are cash flowing him and his clients' income. In this episode, we dive into some of the key strategies that he sees for investing in property abroad and what that looks like in terms of financing, loans, and bankings when you're working outside of the US. So with that, let's dive into today's episode. Please share with us a little bit more about yourself, your story, how you got started in this, what that looks like, and how you got to where you are today.
Okay. Well, it's a very long story, so I try to keep it somewhat concise. It basically started out generally with my service in the German Air Force in Germany. I'm originally from Germany, and due to the job I was in flight testing, I had the opportunity to go over to the US a couple of times to the companies that actually made the equipment that we then integrated into the planes, and to really understand what the engineers came up with, then to see and how to translate that for the crews. I needed to get the training there, come back home, get it in the plane, and then basically create the procedures and checklists and stuff. So doing that for a couple of years, my wife and I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if there would be an opportunity to be in the States for more than just like 4 to 6 weeks for training at a time? And I researched it and found out there's an exchange program and applied for it. And with a few little hiccups and hurdles and stuff like that, I was accepted. And that created the first kind of little bit of an international property situation, because we had bought a house at the Air Force station I was stationed at. And then when we got basically the orders to move to the US, to New Mexico, the question was, what do we do with it? So my parents actually agreed that they would do the management without ever having done it. So we found a tenant and then we moved, and then the tenant did some of the things you don't want tenants to do, and my dad didn't like. So that was the first kind of experience, and ultimately got to the US, did my service there, and then retired in 2001 from the Air Force, because you get to a point where you can't fly anymore, and was immediately recruited into a software company in California. We moved there, everything good, basically back to a pretty normal corporate life. And then about 5 years later, I started my own business and began realizing, okay, when you have your own business, you don't have like the military or 401k or those kind of things, at least not when you're a startup. So I was like, okay, what can I do to maybe get to a point where we don't have to work forever until we're 90 or something? Stock market had just recently collapsed through the dot-com bust at the time. And so I was looking into what alternative. Now, real estate wasn't my first choice, but I could at least make the argument that even though that experience in Germany wasn't the best, it was still better than what most people had to suffer through with the stock market. So I thought, okay, I just have to learn how to do it right. Now, the other thing that maybe if you want to talk about what the experience are, what I'm doing now with real estate investing and supporting people, was that we were living in Santa Barbara, California, and that's really not an easy place to invest unless you already have a lot of money. So for me, conceptually was, how can we invest in real estate away from home and mainly focus on the performance of the investment rather than the location? I know everybody says real estate is location, 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 but that's when you want to move into it, not necessarily when you want to invest into it. Right. So I developed the Idea Right Score program originally, not really knowing that that's the name. I just did it for us in the family until people said, hey, can I do this too? And then because of this kind of half of my life being on the European continent, half of my life being on the North American continent, I always felt, what are other opportunities? And I got into international investing, and we can go from there into more detail, by initially looking into other kinds than just the traditional investing in a house type of real estate. So I invested in a cacao farm. I invested in some coffee farms, literally the land of the farm. And then, the company built the farm out to have dual income, the increase in value of the property itself, plus the income that can be generated from the crops. And then, went from there because the roots to Europe are obviously still there and still strong. And there was more and more discontent with this kind of semi-socialist stuff that's going on in the European Union. And people wanted to, okay, how can I protect my assets? Where can I invest? And so that brought in things like, for example, Dubai, which we have pretty strong ties to by now, or the UAE. And so those are, a little bit South America, a little bit UAE, and then still the majority is still in the US.
Okay, interesting. So you hold properties globally, make an income from that, properties or just lots of land, it sounds like farms. Um, and then you assist clients in that as well.
Right. Then the program that I mentioned, Idea Wealth Grower, is a mentoring program where I help people in two ways. Number one is if you're not already a pretty sophisticated or accredited investor, the program helps you mainly in two ways. Number one is obviously get access to properties and all the stuff that you need to learn so that you don't make the mistake I first did when I was, renting a house in Germany without proper management. That is obviously not a good way to go. So learning how to do this, how to pick the properties, how to get financing, how to get them insured, how to make sure they perform, all that stuff. The other part within the mentoring program is, and that's always important to me, is how do you look at it from a generational legacy and protection perspective? So I would say, I would try to teach you to, if it were you, Nicole, and mentor you to become the queen of your own empire, which then includes the investments and all the things around it, so that for one, you can actually ultimately get a passive income life, which in your lifestyle would probably be nice. And then on the other hand, also to be sure to say, okay, well, I might have kids or I have family and I want to transfer what I have been building over the years and over my life to the next generation. That's all part in the mentoring program. The other much simpler option is where people say, okay, I'm relatively sophisticated, I have done investments, but I don't have easy access to this huge set of resources that I have developed the last 15 years. So for those people, I basically help them to get access to the properties that my mentoring clients get access to.
Interesting. Okay, so you mentioned a lot in there. I want to pick apart a few things and go in a few different directions. Very interesting conversation to me because we're not just talking about the US. So it's very overarching. But you mentioned within that financing. I know when you get outside of the US, especially in countries here in Latin America or outside of the Schengen zone, it can be different and more difficult to get financing. So, I mean, this question itself could be an entire episode, I'm sure, but just to give us a glimpse, what does that look like for some of these more untraditional markets for a lot of Americans?
Well, and there's basically, I want to say, three ways to look at how to buy a property. And they are not just international, they pretty much apply every time you look into real estate. The first way is to say you find something that you want to invest in, you pay outright. At least from the seller's perspective, you come in with the money, you give them the money they asked for, whatever was negotiated, and you pay for it. That's basically considered a cash purchase. Now, the second option is, and that's probably what you are referring to when you say being tricky, is what I call the local option. Local means it's relatively easy, for example, for me still having a German passport to buy property in the EU or Schengen area, as you rightfully call it, as well as in the US, because I have all the, legal rights to buy in the US. If I came to Paraguay where you are, or we were to go to like Dubai or Abu Dhabi or something like that, we are not local and we are not residents or anything like that. So the local financing then becomes tricky because most of the time the local banks or lending organizations would say, okay, if you suddenly stop paying, Nicole or Axel or anybody listening to us, how are we getting a hold of you? And then the third option, and that's why it's tricky, by the way, right? Like because they're afraid that they can get a hold of you and have very hard legal processes to get through. If you decide you go to Chile, how do they go from Paraguay to Chile? Or if I decide I go to Spain, not just for vacation, but permanently, and I have stuff in, let's say, Dubai, and I try local financing, that could be tricky. Now, the third option is where we as the investor and the location is not, from a financing perspective, as relevant as the property itself. Where the lender, regardless, imagine anywhere in the world there's a lender who says, I make international real estate investments based on the performance of the real estate. So what does that mean? If you have, for example, a property, let's say in Dubai, that is currently under construction and is for sale for you to buy, let's say for 400,000 euros or dollars, doesn't really matter. And the lender says, okay, you give me 25% down, right? Like something like 80,000 or something like that, 100,000 maybe. And the rest is going to be financed, but purely on the expectation of the property. Why would they do this? In those markets, at least for the last few years and probably still for a little bit, the whole game is what's called appreciation. Or you could say that people are assuming that when they buy something now and in 2 years it's all finished and nicely landscaped and ready to move in, it's gonna be anywhere between 40 and 80% more expensive. Right? So if you buy something for 400,000 now, and let's just pick a middle point of 50% in appreciation, you would have a value of 600,000. So the lender or the bank or whoever you would call them, whatever you would call them, they would say, okay, so we're giving somebody 300,000 euros or dollars, and we have a lien, basically our right to the property that's worth $600,000. So the risk that they take is maximum 50%. If they inherit, so to speak, because you and I or whoever it is disappearing, they know when this thing is finished and we put it on the market, we will always get our 300,000 back. So the risk is low. By the way, this doesn't just apply for like Dubai or the United Arab Emirates. The same thing fundamentally exists in the US as well. For anybody listening from the US side, there are two things. One thing is called a non-recourse loan, which is exactly the same thing. You get basically maximum 50% of the market value of the property, which gives the lender assurance that if you somehow disappear, if they only risk 50%, it's very, very unlikely that they wouldn't get at least that 50% back, even if they sell the property for a relatively low price. And then the other lending, not quite as extreme, is called DSCR. And what that means is basically the lender looks at the property as an investment property. Let's take a little bit less expensive, like a $200,000 house in Ohio. And they look at it at the location and they run their analysis and they see it rents anywhere between $1,800 and $2,000 a month. Right? They know that the payments for the mortgage and insurance and all the other stuff, let's say, is $1,500 a month. Everything in. And that would be a pretty bad interest rate. So what they say is, okay, even if Axel and Nicole again disappear and don't want to pay, we can just let the property sit there, be it rented for $1,800, $1,900, $2,000 a month, and our cost will be covered. And then if for some reason, if we don't want to run it as an investment property anymore, we will probably be able to sell it in a few years while our mortgage dues are always paid. And then we sell it and we don't have a loss. Again, in this case, DSCR is somewhere in this 75% lending. So you can see in this third category where it's dependent on the property, the lenders are looking at the risk and they try to limit the risk purely to the property. They don't even say, does Nicole have a good credit score, or does Nicole have a great income, or whatever other things that you would normally find in those other two categories, which determine should we lend or shouldn't we lend. It's mainly, how does the property perform? If the performance is good enough, then the risk is low enough, and then we're willing to give the money. So those are kind of the three options that typically exist. And I would say for quote unquote a foreigner, so if you're looking at a property where you have no status, the local option is typically the hardest.
Interesting. Okay. So just from that, I could see that there is quite a few different strategies to diversify and get into different markets. I'm curious in your opinion and also what you are seeing from clients, what are some markets around the globe that are of interest now? And then what if we start talking just kind of an average, what are some of the yields that somebody who is looking to invest in these markets can expect to get?
Um, well, there are a couple of things to kind of look at this. First, we would have to look at, okay, are we talking about somebody in the United States looking to diversify internationally? I can say if you try to find properties internationally for a similar passive income performance, I would say don't do it or stop because you are already in the best market. In my opinion, the best market for performance in the context of cash flow or passive income is in the United States, because not only that you have this huge, basically continent-sized country with all the variations from the most expensive places in Santa Monica or, beaches in Miami or downtown New York, all the way to places in the Midwest, where it's literally an order of magnitude, right? You have one property cost $1 million and a similar property cost $100,000 in the same country. So it's really a matter, and that was my story, right? Like I was in Santa Barbara, couldn't afford anything, barely my own house. Investing was pretty much out of the question. But I could find properties in Idaho, in Tennessee, in Ohio, in Missouri, and so forth that were in my price range and in my affordability range. But then on top of that, not to forget is if you buy an investment property because you want to generate passive income, the government says, okay, we look at this like a little engine. And if you buy an engine for your business, you are obviously allowed to depreciate it because everybody knows an engine doesn't run forever. Well, they treat a house the same way and say, over the next 27 and a half years, you can every year take a little bit off and apply it to your taxes because that house supposedly is ultimately worth nothing. Now, we know that's not true, but if you treat it like an engine, that's one thing. Then the other thing is, if you look at it from your own money perspective, if you can get it for 20 or 25% down and the rest of the money comes from somewhere else, and you don't pay it back, but the tenant pays it back, that's pretty cool. Then typically, even though the engine is supposedly losing value, the reality is we have always had at least 3 or 4% appreciation in real estate. So if you take all of those things together, you ask yourself, why is he telling me all of this? Well, if you're doing it right and you're not greedy or super risky, you're ending up probably close to 20% return on your money. Now, that's why I'm saying in the US, if you're there and if you're interested in real estate investing, you're already in the best passive income market. On the other hand, if you say, okay, I'm interested in appreciation, then the whole thing about location, location, location from the performance perspective starts kicking in. And in the US, I would say we, after the pandemic, went through this enormous boost where all the desirable locations just went completely crazy in prices. And even though they have come a little bit down, if you think about appreciation means your main focus is that the property you buy is going to gain in value in the next, let's say 3, 5, maybe 10 years maximum, short to medium term. Well, if it's already priced at the top of where it has been ever in the last 10 years, it's just harder, right? Like I always say, if you think about a business that is $1 billion business and you want it to double, it's really hard to get it to $2 billion. If you have a business that makes 100,000 a year and you want to get it to 200,000, that's definitely easier to do. If you think about it that way, the US is currently, in my opinion, not necessarily a great appreciation market, even though there might be some pockets where it could work. In comparison, I gave the example with the United Arab Emirates. That's been in the last 5, 6, 7 years, and it looks like it's probably going to be at least a few more years, a very strong appreciation market. You're not going to make a lot of money there by buying something and then want to have it paid off by some tenant over the next 20 years or something like that. but you can get into development deals, especially for some luxury properties, finance and everything, where you have a really good chance to get strong appreciation. Now, I would always say if you compare the two, appreciation is more, like I said, a short to medium term approach, and passive income is a really long-term generational approach. And what some people do, and we help them obviously with it, is some people say, okay, I'm as young as Nicole, so I have time. So I do appreciation first, taking a little bit more risk. And then whenever I have made a gain, I take that and put it into a longer term investment. Because obviously, let's say we take one of those Dubai deals and you make 100,000, you can get 3 properties in the Midwest in the US for that. And so now you hold those in asset value, and they are little engines that produce income for you all the time.
Interesting. Lots of info there. I'm curious. It's interesting that you mentioned the US as the best market. I find the US is great for so many things, banking, investments, as long as you're not living there and as long as you are ideally non-American. There's so many ways to take advantage of the
Yeah, but
US. But you
sorry for interrupting, Nicole, but remember I said Nicole, the queen of her own empire? Part of our mentoring program includes to say, regardless whether you're American or non-American, you can, as a foreigner, create an LLC, your own business. You get a business bank account. You fund the business bank account, and you're good to go. And the only thing you can do is get a traditional government-supported and secured mortgage. Right? If you don't live there, it's pretty hard to do, but you can get all the other ones that we discussed. Right. So even if you say I stay for the rest of my life in Paraguay, or I stay for the rest in Spain, or any place else in the world, as a business owner in the US, you have all the benefits. You don't
Yeah,
have to be
absolutely.
there.
That's what I love. Yeah, I totally agree. That's what I love about the US. I have business there. I do personal banking there, investments there, obviously business banking, and we help set up a lot of our clients with that. It's such an interesting and great system to take advantage of as a non-American. Not a system I'd want to be in full time, but to take advantage of it, it's great. But I'm curious. So you have properties in Ohio, Idaho, Illinois, Florida, Belize, Panama, Spain. Name some other countries that you have properties as well. I'm curious what you see in terms of, as you mentioned, appreciation. If we're not talking outside of the UAE or traditional markets like the US, what you've seen for that, yield, where you advise clients to go if they maybe are American or non-American, but looking to diversify outside of the US market. I'm curious what that looks like for you, having so much global experience in property investment.
Yeah, I would say appreciation depends a little bit in the context of what location you're at. So, for example, if you want to rather have a more steady income stream, you probably have to be willing to live with appreciation in like the below 10 and sometimes more closer to 5%. Now, you have to keep in mind leverage is a very important aspect in this context, right? Like just to explain that real quick, very briefly, if you just for the ease of numbers, right? I know there are not really $100,000 houses around, but if you take $100,000 property and you do the traditional financing, let's even say DSCR with 25% down. So you actually have 25,000 in the deal, and the bank or lender DSCR has 75,000. Now that property, that kind of fake property, if that gets 4%, which is by no means a huge appreciation, right? But that's $4,000 on your $25,000, because even though it's leveraged, you have 100% of the benefit, right? So with a little bit of math, that is like what 2,500. So that's in the area of like 17, 18% right there, right? On your money. And that's really how you need to look at it, right? Like now, a lot of people look at the overall asset value. So if you say, okay, the $100,000 property appreciated 4%, that's not much. And for Dubai, admittedly, there wouldn't be much. You want to see something more like 10%, 20%, 30% per year, right? But if you look at, can you get 75% financing for a Dubai property that's not finished yet? Probably not. Let's just say it is only 50%. right? And the property is a luxury property that costs multitudes of the Ohio property or something like that. Then, yes, nominally the appreciation is higher, but when you really convert it, what is it in net money that I'm actually making on my invested capital? It may not be that much more. So that's really the point to look at. Now, I'm also cautioning anybody listening in us talking about United Arab Emirates that you need to be in, not to step on anybody's toes, but you need to be willing to keep a pretty close eye on macroeconomic and global political developments. When you ask the question, just to give a little bit of a hint, why is this important? You ask the question, where is this pretty extreme appreciation the last 5 years been coming from in the UAE? And the answer to some extent is the draw that this place has from a financial perspective, from a sophistication perspective, and from a business perspective. But one very, very strong component that a lot of people will not necessarily mention is that they were quite a bit of very affluent people in Ukraine and a lot of pretty affluent people in Russia. And both, when the war started, or even before, the year before the war already, they could see the writing on the wall and they wanted to get their assets out. And when you say, well, why Russia? Well, because they were basically decoupled from the Western banking system. So for them, anything that was related to the Western banking system, they were eager to keep it within that system. Right. So you have these two populations of affluent people wanting to go somewhere where they believe that they would be relatively protected. Right. So outside of all the countries that are sanctioning and threatening and playing war games and what have you. Well, and then you want also sophistication if you have that kind of money. Am I saying they are the only source of why appreciation has been as high as it has been? I don't want to say that exclusively, but we need to keep an eye on that. And the question is, let's just say the current developments of finding and creating peace are successful. Let's say by the end of the year that war is over. Are they going to keep, number one, their money there? Possible. Are they going to bring more money in? Not very likely, in my opinion. Right? So by keeping an eye on what is going on in the world, what are kind of like the developments, what are potential causes for extreme appreciation, for extreme money flows, for unusual situations is very important. Right? So if you can, obviously, I encourage everybody, find somebody who is doing this if you don't want to do it yourself and then take advantage. But you also got to be careful because I would be somebody who is very closely for our clients keeping an eye on it. And most likely, if my predictions are right, probably start advising not to risk more money until we know what is happening after the war.
Interesting. Very interesting using geopolitics as an indicator of the markets. I mean, yeah, definitely something worthwhile. And I would be curious to see what you see in the long term of where that trajectory goes specific to the UAE, that flow of wealth. But I want to talk about you have a principle, I believe, called underdog for underdog properties and how these properties typically outperform hotter, let's say, properties. So can you share a little bit more about what that is and what that looks like for you and your investors?
Yeah, in a way, it's basically to say you really need to divorce yourself from the emotional decision making when it comes to investing and making purchases. One of the underdog is maybe not the perfect term, but the point is more when you have achieved a certain level of success and wealth and income and so forth, you obviously develop your tastes and the level of sophistication and maybe even a little bit of a level of luxury and so forth. And people sometimes forget how much we are influenced by our subconscious, right? What are the things we like and what are the things that we try to stay away from? And now put that on one side, and on the opposite side, you put a spreadsheet with pure like logical numbers, mathematics. right? And I can show you a property where you would say, wow, I can't even imagine that anybody would buy this. And this thing is ugly. And you look at, like, well, but that's all emotional. What is more important is what's the substance, what's the income potential, what is the purchasing price, what's the cash flow, what are the financing options, all purely mathematical things. So while most people have a hard time getting themselves in this conscious mindset to say, I'm investing purely on numbers and performance and not on what I like, that's really a task that I face every day in mentoring with my clients. And sometimes I'm successful to get them to the point to say, okay, the numbers don't lie. And sometimes people say, yeah, I know the numbers don't lie, but that thing is so ugly, I can't do it. So now the other part in this context of underdog is also I encourage people just in general, especially if you're listening to us from the US, if you go through and drive through any kind of reasonably good neighborhoods, like residential neighborhoods, you will find that almost always you find individual properties in a generally nice neighborhood that look for some unexplained reason kind of run down, not very much cared for, and so forth. And that's basically how I first started working with what's called turnkey providers, because they basically do something that they call buying the ugly duckling in a good neighborhood. Right. So that's that one or two properties among all the other ones where the owners keep them pretty nicely. But there's one or two, not necessarily in the same street, that somehow look like, wow, they haven't really been touched or done anything to in years. What often happens is somebody lived there, then they moved away for whatever reason and turned it into a rental property. Then it was rented for a while, but may not have performed very well. And then they decided, well, it's too much work and it's too far away and I don't want to get property management, because now in the state it is in, they say, well, we can rent it if you don't fix it. And that's a lot of money. So it just sits there. Yeah, that's one scenario. Or the other scenario, somebody lived in a property for a very long time, maybe even from when it was originally built, gets really, really old and ultimately crosses the rainbow bridge, so to speak. And then the kids or whoever the heirs are now owning this property, and they really have no need for it. Right. So that's also why turnkey providers like these scenarios, because they can ask someone, hey, we found out that you own this property. It's not in good shape, probably costs quite a bit of money. We make you a cheeky offer, but at least you have the cash. So then they get into these properties and they basically renovate them down to the studs, bring them up, and that ugly duckling becomes the swan of the neighborhood, which also then means it attracts people who like to live in that neighborhood as tenants, and they like to move into a house that is almost as good as a brand new house. It just has the old bones, but it's all renovated, new kitchen, new bathroom, new floors, or new windows oftentimes, right? So those are kind of like those, you know, underdogs, I don't know, but they're basically the high potential properties. And what you don't need to do anymore, like the neighborhood is settled, it's safe, it's still close to shopping and good schools and those kind of things. Whereas if you get in a new build area nowadays, oftentimes they have to go quite a few ways out to build something new, like a new 50 or 100 unit neighborhood. And in my observation, oftentimes those get built first and then the shops and everything else comes after. Versus a neighborhood that already exists, that's already basically serviced in everything that you need, and you just fix something to bring it up to the good standard and make it nice again.
Yeah, interesting opportunities that are available there that I'm sure a lot of people bypass, but I also find it really interesting that you are conscious of bridging the perception that a lot of people have when it comes to property and I don't want to own this because it's not something that I would want to live in versus just strictly being an investment property alone. Do you find that it's more beneficial to have that second mindset mentioned when somebody is not living in that country? And so they're thinking, I likely am not going to go there. Maybe I don't have residency there. I don't have the rights to live there longer term. So I am just looking for investment. I don't really care how it looks from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, the country, not living or being close to that country is kind of like an even stronger motivator to look at it that way. Like I mentioned in my own case, we were in Santa Barbara, basically on one end of the country, and like Ohio was like what 2,000 miles away. That's almost like enough, right? Like if you go from California um, north that much, you're somewhere in northern Canada, and if you go south, you're at the like Cabo somewhere in Mexico. Just happens if you go east, you don't leave the country, but it's still the same distance. So distance is obviously um, a strong aspect in this thing. The other one, and I keep harping back on that, is I actually wrote, and happy to make that available to your audience as a little gift. I wrote something I call the mindset manual. And that is really giving a few exercises to encourage people to gain kind of consciousness. I'm not saying you're not conscious, but it's maybe not something that you're thinking about it all the time. Kind of go through the exercise and find out how far am I in my self-confidence? Like for yourself, you would say, as a woman, how far is my self-confidence that I can really be the CEO, president, queen, whatever term you want to use for yourself, of this business, of this company that its purpose is to build my investing portfolio. How much do I have my mindset that I'm not looking at a bank as if they have a right to dictate? I need to look at them, if I'm looking at it from the perspective of a CEO or president, they are competing for my business. And if you ever drive around anywhere, Paraguay, in the US, in anywhere, there are plenty of banks. They're all in the business of lending. So, right, they need to earn your business. Same thing, I mean, not quite similar, but in a way, property management. Right? Anything that is not owner occupied is typically managed. And the very rare case that somebody, the investor, him or herself, is managing it. So there are plenty of property management organizations. They're competing for you giving them the business. And on, if you go through all the things that are associated with an investment property, they are all competing, and they should treat you that way. Right? It shouldn't be that the bank is dictating what is acceptable and is not acceptable. If they do stuff that you are not comfortable with, you can and should be able in your mindset to say, I'm a self-confident man or woman or owner of my business. If they don't want to play ball, I find somebody else, and I'm not shy to tell them. Now, what that basically ultimately means is that you're educating and basically forming the relationships that you are willing to have with the people that want to participate in the building of your portfolio. And that is the same anywhere in the world. Now, admittedly, there are some cultural things. If you as a woman try to basically have that role in the UAE with local organizations, you have to become a little bit familiar with the cultural differences and the religious differences and stuff like that. But fundamentally, professionalism applies everywhere, which one big component of that is respect. Right? And you can demonstrate that respect in your body language, in your choice of words, in the way you approach people, in your awareness of the local habits. But that doesn't mean that you have to give in to everything. So that's really the component, I believe, that is very important. And if you look at it that way, then it becomes also a little easier to say, okay, well, if I were just any CEO of a business, would any fellow CEO do this investment, work with this company, spend their money on this, so forth, right? Like, and if you look at it that way, you can learn over time what is an appropriate and successful behavior. And so I'm always proud of our mentoring clients, not just because they tap into the network and get a portfolio together over time, but because they're also evolving as individuals to really live into that role.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that. Thank you for bringing that up. I see the same with government in my perspective, where the government needs to be competing for your business and for your livelihood. of spending money, making money, paying taxes, all of the different taxes in that country. And if it's not benefiting you, you have almost 200 other options. Most of them you probably don't want to choose from, but you still have a good handful of options where you would want to potentially go and relocate and maybe pay lower taxes or have a better quality of life. So I like that that is a prominent part of your mentorship as well. And you see it that way with banks, with other businesses, with partners, sounds like with everything in your business. So thank you, Axel, for sharing everything you've shared today. A lot of good information. Where can people find you and the program online?
The easiest is to just go to idealwealthgrower.com, and then we have a button there to do a complimentary call or fill out a contact sheet. Or if you're really brave, you can just sign up for the mentoring program if you like that. So we have everything on the website. I always find it's easiest. Just go idealwealthgrower.com and you find what you're looking for.
You've just listened to the Worldwise Wealth podcast. Visit our links in the show notes below or at worldwisecapital.com to learn more about how we can assist in your borderless diversification journey. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode.